All right, engineers, in this video, we're going to talk about the development of the GI tract. This is part 2. If you haven't, go and see part 1, all right? Because in part 1, we talked about the embryonic folding, we talked about the intraperitoneal, retroperitoneal, and pathologies, right? In this video, we're going to be specifically focusing on the foregut, the midgut, the hindgut, their components, vascular supply, and their mesenteries. Before we do that, though, there's something really interesting about the foregut, okay? The foregut is one of the only, out of all of these guts, the foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut, the foregut, if you remember, during the embryonic folding process, we said that it was actually near the cranial end where the oropharyngeal membrane is, which helps to form the mouth. The foregut is really special because it actually has two mesenteries, a ventral and a dorsal. Before we show that, though, let's go ahead and put the gut tube here. So we're going to show, here's going to be the foregut tube, right? And then around the foregut tube, what do we have around it, if you remember? It was the visceral serosa, or the visceral peritoneum, right? Then we had, covering the walls, if you remember, we had the parietal peritoneum, right? That was the parietal peritoneum. And then what was really special is that you have these mesenteries. And the mesenteries are what are connecting the visceral peritoneum to the parietal peritoneum. So these are our mesenteries. So let's say that this is the anterior end, and this is going to be the posterior end, or you can say dorsal and ventral, right? So here's our gut tube for the foregut. This is a mesentery, which is in the dorsal part, or the posterior part. What do you think we're going to call that? We're going to call the dorsal mesentery. But we always have to make things complicated, don't we? So we actually call it the dorsal mesogastrium. Okay? This is in the ventral side, or the anterior side. So we're going to call it the ventral mesentery. But again, we're actually going to call it the ventral mesogastrium. So they call this the ventral mesogastrium. Real quick, because I didn't really get a chance to explain it, what is a mesentery? You know, mesentery is actually an organ. So it's really cool. It's actually an organ. A mesentery is a double-layered membrane. It's a double-layered membrane. But what is that double-layered membrane? Specifically, if I just kind of look here for a second, let's say here's what I'm going to kind of show as a mesentery. Okay? Let's say here's the organ for a second. Here's the organ, just a generic organ. Doesn't matter for this situation. But the mesentery is a double-layered membrane. Okay? The double layer is mainly going to be made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So it's actually going to be having simple squamous epithelial tissue. And then underneath this simple squamous epithelial tissue, as a part of the basement membrane, you have like an areolar connective tissue, which is kind of acting as the basement membrane. You know what they call that? They call that mesothelium. So a mesentery is a double-layered membrane made up of simple squamous epithelial cells, double-layered, with a little basement membrane made up of areolar connective tissue. Guess what that mesentery is good for? It's good for blood vessels to flow through to the organ. It's good for veins to come and drain the organ. It's good for nerve fibers that are going to come in here. For example, splanchnic nerves that are going to go and innervate the organ. And even lymphatic vessels too. So it's a really, really important structure. Okay? So a mesentery is a double-layered serous membrane with epithelial cells, simple squamous, areolar connective tissue as the basement membrane, and it allows for this potential space where blood vessels, nerves, and even lymphatic vessels can travel from the actual abdominal wall into the organ through these mesenteries. That's so cool. Okay? So let's get back to this now that I got off track. Now, what happens is, during this development, the anterior portion, where the ventral mesogastrium is, it's going to start turning. And it's going to go clockwise. So there's going to be a clockwise rotation. And then this is going to start turning. Now, what happens is the ventral mesogastrium is actually going to help to develop one specifically important organ here, which is going to be for our use. And this organ is going to be the liver. Okay, so the liver, which we're going to just represent here in this purplish color, is going to be developing within the ventral mesogastrium. Okay? In the dorsal mesogastrium, we're going to have another organ here that we're going to have representing back here. Let's have this one in pink. And this organ is going to be the spleen. Okay, so the spleen is going to develop back here. What happens is while this is rotating, right? This is going to be rotating around a central axis. In this gut tube, it's mainly going to be for the stomach, okay, and the proximal portion of the duodenum. As it rotates around the central axis, this stomach and proximal portion of the duodenum, it moves the liver from this anterior portion over here to the right side. So this is the right side, and this is the left side. So this is going to end up on the right side, and the actual spleen is going to end up on the left side. That's so cool. Now guess what that ventral mesogastrium is going to become? The ventral mesogastrium is going to become this main structure which is called the lesser omentum. And we'll talk about these ligaments when we go over this, but there's ligaments that are associated with this, like the hepatoduodenal ligament, like the hepatogastric ligament, and even the falciform ligaments, right? That are really, really important for helping to keep some of these organs that are in the foregut intraperitoneal. The dorsal mesogastrium is going to be important because the dorsal mesogastrium, this is left again, just keeping these here, this is right. The dorsal mesogastrium is going to be helpful in forming what's called the greater omentum. And this is that big pizza cheese that you see if you ever look in like the cadaver labs or you ever look in the textbooks, that big yellow stuff that's just hanging over in the intestines. That's the greater omentum. And there's many ligaments for this one also. For example, to name a few, gastrocolic, gastrosplenic. Also, you're going to have the splenorenal ligaments. And you can even have some other ones that we'll talk about in this process here, okay? Now, to get a good understanding of this, we're going to take one more view so that we can get a better look at the greater omentum, because I think it's going to help us out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one more view. Let's say that we have, let's do this. Let's put here anterior abdominal wall. Here's posterior abdominal wall. Let's put here, let's make this the transverse colon. Let's make this right here the stomach. And here's what we're going to do, right? Oh, and then up here we'll put the liver. Here's going to be our liver, okay? So now, if you remember, what was the connection between the stomach and the proximal portion of the duodenum? If you remember, it was going to be the lesser omentum, okay? It was the lesser omentum. Then, and again, it was going to be the hepatogastric and the hepatoduodenal ligaments. There's a little ending point here where it helps to form a structure called the epiploic foramen, which can lead into a little area behind the stomach called the lesser sac. We'll talk about that. But what happens is, from this guy, there's a part of the stomach called the greater curvature. The greater curvature is where the greater omentum hangs. The lesser curvature is where the lesser omentum actually connects it to the liver and other associated structures, right? But look what happens here. This mesentery kind of hangs down here like this, and then it kind of doubles back up. Now, there's a ligament, or a mesentery specifically, which is anchoring. Let's actually do this one in a different color. It's anchoring this actual transverse colon to the parietal peritoneum. They call it the transverse mesocolon. What happens is this actual omental-like apron, this greater omentum, it actually kind of doubles back. And as it doubles back, it actually kind of fuses with parts of that actual transverse colon, right? The actual ligaments there. And when I say ligaments, I want you guys to understand, it's not the ligaments that you think of that are connecting bone to bone. They're actually peritoneal coverings. So some of you might be like, ligaments, what the frick is he talking about? They're not really true ligaments connecting bone to bone. They're these peritoneal covering-like structures. Okay, so now that we understand that, this is what I wanted you guys to look at. So there's like, imagine here where the hepatoduodenal ligament ends. There's like a space here, like a little space, okay? A little hole here, and that hole can lead you into this structure here. This area right here is called the lesser sac, okay? So they call this area right here the lesser sac. And this hole that we can use to go through that and into the lesser sac, this is called the epiploic foramen. Okay. Anyway, so I just wanted you guys to get an idea of here of really what the greater omentum is and what the lesser omentum is. Okay, that's just a little tidbit. Again, we can cover that in more detail in other videos, but for right now, that's good enough. And again, just remember that this is the anterior body wall and this is the posterior body wall. So again, we covered that. So we covered the mesenteries a little bit more in detail because I wanted to talk about those a little bit before we go into the guts. So now we know the dorsomesogastrium, the ventromesogastrium, the derivative of that within the foregut, greater omentum, which again hangs down here, is like this omental apron, doubles back, kind of fuses with some of the ligaments around the transverse mesocolon and helps to form this little area in the back behind the stomach called the lesser sac. But you can get to the lesser sac through this hole here where the hepatoduodenal ligament ends. There's a little hole there called the epiploic foramen, or if you want to, you can call it the epiploic foramen of Winslow, right? Now, we talked about that. We got the anterior, posterior body wall. Now, what I want to talk about is I want to go into the divisions, right, of the gut tube. So we're going to have 3 divisions of the gut tube. Okay, so we got the foregut, and again, the foregut developed right around the cranial end where the oropharyngeal membrane was. Remember that, helps to form the mouth. Then after that, we're going to have the midgut. And if you remember, this was our relationship that we talked about with the omphalocele. And we also talked about this with the Meckel's diverticulum, right? And then the last one is going to be the hindgut. And this is a really cool one too, okay? And we'll talk about this guy. And this was towards the caudal end where the cloacal membrane was, which helped to be able to form the anal canal as well as the urogenital tract. Okay, so now, foregut. We want to talk about organs, mesenteries, and vascular supply. So let's get the vascular supply down for these bad boys. So the first one is going to be the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk is going to be the main vessel that's going to supply all the components of the foregut. What about the midgut? What about the components, or what about the vascular supply to that guy? That's going to be the superior mesenteric artery. And again, these guys are coming off of the abdominal aorta, right? What about the last one? The last one, which will supply the hindgut, is going to be the inferior mesenteric artery, right? So these guys are pretty cool. Now, I'm not going to go over every single branch of these arteries, okay? We did make a video on that. It's on the thoracic abdominal circulation. It's a flow chart, and we talk about all the branches. I'll mention them in passing, but I'm not going to write them all down, okay? So celiac trunk, what are the 3 main branches? The splenic artery, the left gastric, and the common hepatic. So if you remember that, you'll pretty much be able to remember what organs it supplies. So splenic, spleen. So one of the organs of the foregut is going to be the spleen. What else? I said left gastric. So left gastric is going to go to the stomach. So we're going to have the stomach. Then we said the common hepatic. The common hepatic is going to branch. One of the branches is actually going to be specifically so the common hepatic artery will actually go to the liver. It'll give off branches that give off like cystic artery branches, which will go to the gallbladder. So it's going to give organs to like the liver and the gallbladder. Now another branch of the common hepatic artery is the gastroduodenal artery, which helps to supply the proximal half of the duodenum. Okay? Because they give out the gastroduodenal artery, which will actually form what's called, it'll actually branch into the superior pancreatic duodenal artery. So it's going to be 2 more organs. What are those going to be? One is actually going to be the pancreas. Then there's actually arteries that come off of the splenic artery, like the pancreatic arteries, and they can supply the pancreas as well. But the other one is the gastroduodenal, and the gastroduodenal can go to the superior pancreatic duodenal and supply the proximal half of duodenum. Okay, cool deal. Now, we know that these are the organs that the foregut basically divides into. There is some other ones like the lower respiratory tract, the esophagus, and some other structures, but we're going to mainly focus on these ones. But again, the esophagus is another one. We're going to try to focus below the diaphragm. All right, so mesenteries. Mesenteries are going to be those double-layered serous membranes that help to keep these organs intraperitoneal. Some of them might have it, some of them might not. Okay, so for example, spleen, does it have a mesentery? Yes. What is the name of that mesentery? The specific mesentery is called the splenorenal ligament. Do you remember here, whenever there was the rotation of the foregut, there was the dorsal mesogastrium, here's the spleen. When it rotates, the dorsal mesogastrium is going to mainly become the greater omentum. One of the ligaments of the greater omentum is called the, specifically, the gastrosplenic ligament. Okay, so this is going to be the specific ligament or mesentery here is the gastrosplenic ligament. Now, understand again, these ligaments are not the same ligaments that you think of when they're connecting bone to bone. They're peritoneal membrane coverings, which are basically connecting to these actual digestive organs, anchoring them within the peritoneal cavity and helping them to be suspended in there, allowing for them to be slightly mobile. What about the stomach? The stomach has so many mesenteries. If you remember, whenever it rotates, you have the greater omentum and the lesser omentum. And there are so many individual ligaments of that. To mention a few, the gastrophrenic, gastrocolic, gastrosplenic. There's so many, hepatogastric. We're not going to name them all. I'm just going to say it's going to be the greater and lesser omentum. Okay? So we're going to put here the greater and lesser omentum. All right, what about the liver? Remember, where did the liver derive from? The ventral mesogastrium. So the ventral mesogastrium is going to form the lesser omentum whenever it rotates, right? So the lesser omentum, if you remember, the main ligaments of this one is the hepatogastric, hepatoduodenal, and the falciform ligament. But this is going to be connecting not just to the liver, but also it's going to be helping to hold the gallbladder intraperitoneal as well. So the liver and the gallbladder are going to be maintained intraperitoneal by the lesser omentum. Okay, so this is specifically going to be the lesser omentum, but there's another one too, which is going to be specifically the falciform ligament too. Okay, so you're going to have a couple of these guys here, lesser omentum, and then you're going to have another one here called the falciform ligament. Okay, the lesser omentum is specifically the hepatoduodenal and the hepatogastric. There's another one too for the liver, which is the coronary ligaments. We're not going to mention that. Okay, so for the liver and the gallbladder, it's going to be the lesser omentum and the falciform ligament. Okay? What about the pancreas? Now the pancreas, you've got to be careful. The pancreas actually has three parts: head, body, tail. Head and the body are actually secondary retroperitoneal, meaning they had a mesentery, but they lost it. The tail maintains a mesentery, and remember, as it's rotating, okay, the pancreas has a specific component, specifically a part of the greater omentum. They call it the splenorenal ligament. But this is only for the tail of the pancreas, not the head and the body. All right, what about the proximal half of the duodenum? So the first part and the second part of the duodenum. The first part of the duodenum, about the first 2 centimeters of the duodenum, actually does have a mesentery. It's called the hepatoduodenal ligament, which is a part of the lesser omentum. So again, this one will have it, but only the first part. It is called the hepatoduodenal ligament. But again, this is only the first part. The second, third, and fourth part are actually going to be secondary retroperitoneal. All right, so that's these guys. Let's go to the next one, midgut. Midgut is going to be supplied by the superior mesenteric artery. There's so many branches. There's this sucker, right? But let's go from the top. So what happens is, remember we ended off with the proximal half of the duodenum? Well, we have the third and fourth part. So let's go on to that part. So the superior mesenteric artery gives off intestinal arteries. Those intestinal arteries are going to go and specifically supply the, we'll just put the distal half of the duodenum. So, distal half of the duodenum, right? Now, let's just keep going, right? The next one, intestinal arteries supply the jejunum. Do you know actually how we separate where the duodenum ends and the jejunum begins? There's a special ligament. It's called the ligament of Tract, right? The suspensory muscle of the duodenum. It's actually the point which is suspending the fourth part of the duodenum, right? And it's keeping it retroperitoneal, but it's the nice point of where the fourth part of the duodenum ends and the jejunum begins, right? So jejunum, ileum, right? These are these main ones here, right? Part of the small intestine. Now, another branch of the superior mesenteric artery is the ileocolic artery, which helps to supply the distal part of the ileum right around the ileocecal junction, or around the valve area, and as well as the cecum. So now, we're going to have the ileum, and we're also going to have the cecum. What else do we have hanging from the cecum? What's that nice little sucker hanging from there? The appendix, the vermiform appendix. Okay, then after that, it gives off arterial branches that go to the right side, right? Towards the ascending colon. So we're going to have the right colic arteries, which supplies the ascending colon. And then we're going to have these other branches, which are going to go upwards and supply the transverse colon. They're called the middle colic arteries. Okay, they're going to supply the transverse colon. But we have to, again, be very, very particular because the transverse colon, we only supply it to around the proximal 2/3. So proximal 2/3, okay? Close to around the area of what's called the splenic flexure or the left colic flexure. All right, so now we got that. What's the mesenteries? The mesenteries, distal half of the duodenum. Does it have one? No, no mesenteries. So let's put here no mesenteries. It's actually going to be retroperitoneal. What about the jejunum and the ileum? They're both actually anchored through what's called the small bowel mesentery. Okay? Or some people even call it the mesentery proper, right? But the small bowel mesentery is fine. Now, what about the cecum? The cecum's odd. Sometimes, in some people, it's intraperitoneal, and sometimes it's retroperitoneal. So sometimes it's actually kind of tough because sometimes the small bowel mesentery might actually keep the cecum intraperitoneal, and sometimes it might not. So for here, we're going to put that it varies. Okay? What about the appendix? Well, the appendix is also going to have one too. It does have a mesentery. They call this, anytime you hear the word meso, it's probably going to mean a mesentery of some form. This is called the mesoappendix. So it is going to be a mesentery that keeps the appendix intraperitoneal. What about the ascending colon? Nope. This sucker has retroperitoneal. It also has this little kind of like white fibrous tissue on the side of it called the white line of Tolt. We're not going to talk about that though. But again, the ascending colon, the main thing is it is retroperitoneal. Okay, so it's not going to have a mesentery. It did previously, called the ascending mesocolon, but during the rotation it gets obliterated against the posterior abdominal wall. Okay, so here, no mesentery. Okay, transverse colon, proximal 2/3. Yes, it's actually called the transverse mesocolon. Okay, so pretty simple there for that one, right? Okay, sweet deal. So now we covered foregut, midgut. Now we go on to this last sucker right here, which is called the hindgut. Now, the hindgut is primarily going to be supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. So remember the branches of the inferior mesenteric artery. One of the branches is going to be called the left colic. So now we're going to have ones that are going to the left side, which is called the left colic arteries. So now, if we remember the inferior mesenteric artery, right? Well, actually, let's make it even easier on ourselves. Transverse colon, proximal 2/3. That's where the midgut ends. So where do you think it's going to begin? The distal 1/3 of the transverse colon. So let's put here the distal 1/3 of, I'm going to put TC here, transverse colon. Actually, I'll finish this part out, colon, right? Now, we got that part. That's going to be kind of the branches of the left colic arteries, can give some supply over to that area, right? What else? Okay, well now we got to go to the next guy. We got to go down. So now we have the descending colon. Then the descending colon wraps in like an S-like shape. So they call that the sigmoid colon. And then it goes into the next part, which is the rectum. Rectum dang near killed him, right? So we got the upper rectum. Now, I thought you said rectum. Yeah, it is the upper rectum, but it stops at a specific point. You know where the upper rectum actually kind of hits where the hindgut ends? It's actually going to be called the pectinate line. So the pectinate line is really good at being able to separate the upper rectum from the lower rectum. Okay? So now we got hindgut here, distal 1/3, descending colon, sigmoid colon, upper rectum, pectinate line. And again, if you remember the arteries, you can remember left colic for the distal 1/3 and the descending colon. You can remember the, what is the other guy here? We're also going to have the sigmoidal arteries, and we're going to have the superior rectal artery. Okay? So you're going to have the sigmoidal artery, the superior rectal artery, and again, you'll have the left colic. Now, what about the mesenteries? Okay, well, we already said the distal 1/3 of the transverse colon. The transverse colon has to have a mesentery. We already know that. So what does it got to be? Let me get back down here and destroy my knees here, right? So this is going to be the transverse mesocolon. All right, what about the descending colon? The descending colon actually did have, at some point in time, a mesentery. It was called the descending mesocolon. But again, during that rotation, it got obliterated against the posterior abdominal wall and it lost its mesentery. So this sucker has no mesentery. Okay? Sigmoid colon, it actually does develop one. It's called the sigmoid mesocolon. Okay? And then the upper rectum. Now the upper rectum doesn't have any mesentery here. Okay? So it's actually not going to be considered an intraperitoneal organ, it's considered a retroperitoneal organ. Okay? So we have covered the foregut, its components, the mesenteries and the vascular supply, as well as the same thing for the midgut and the hindgut. All right, engineers, so that covers pretty much everything that you guys would need to know about the development of the GI tract and all this large outline that we covered. All right, engineers, I can't say thank you enough for watching these videos. I hope that they helped. I hope they made sense. If you guys did like them, please hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, please subscribe. Also, guys, we have an Instagram, a Facebook account. Go in, check those out, leave comments, right? Also, we have a Patreon account that you guys, please, every dollar counts. It all matters and it helps us to make the highest quality videos for you guys. All right, so Ninja Nerds, as always, until next time.